Greetings everyone, this is Ehav and today I'm going to be talking about Jewish migrations into West Africa. Okay, so this presentation is going to be a part 2, if you will, to the one I just recently did of episode 18, which is Israeli national identity. The information I'm going to be presenting in this is based upon real information, not just some kind of like made-up concept, as well as the sources are going to be provided at the end of it. So feel free to ask questions. So in the last video, I talked about Israeli national identity, where it came from, how it got started, and how it progressed over time. So in this presentation, I'm going to be dealing with a specific group of communities that were started after the this evolvement of the Israeli national identity. So in the last video, as you remember, I went through and showed you some different categories of Israeli culture in terms of ethnicity, and that's being shown right now. The one I'm going to be specifically talking about now can be kind of termed in what I would call Maghrebim, and that's normally called North African Jews, but in this case it'll also include Jews who were from West Africa, who originally originated from other places, but then eventually ended up in West Africa. So let's now look at the locations that we're going to be talking about in this presentation. Right now, a lot of the arrows that you see are pointing mostly to places in Africa as well as parts of the Middle East. This is going to be important for the discussion. So the earliest theories in terms of Israeli presence in Africa, is believed to have been either during the time of David and Solomon or after the destruction of the two temples in Jerusalem. During that period in time, there were a number of kingdoms that existed in West Africa as well as different parts of Africa that a number of Yisraelim or Yehudim traveled through and eventually ended up in West Africa. Okay, so when we talk about this region, one of the terms that is usually used in many of the, Arabic documents concerning the region we're talking about is the Bilad al-Sudan, or the Bilad al-Sudan, depending on how you go by the Arabic. This is often described sometimes as all of Africa, as well as in some cases specifically West Africa near the Niger River. So this is the area that we'll be talking about, and it's called the Bilad al-Sudan. So in order to first get an idea of the region in terms of travel, I think the best place to start is in terms of the Amazigh or the Kaltamashek, which are Berbers, who normally used to do the trade between East Africa and West Africa. There are a number of legends that, some of them going back to the First Temple period, that places Jews in the region who eventually became Muslims after the Islamic invasions, and as well as a Jewish queen who once supposedly ruled over these various groups at one point. When we look at this map here, this gives us one of the routes, one of the main routes that used to take place between North Africa and West Africa. And this is, like a big part of this story in terms of understanding how Jews came to the region. So going back, there are a number of legends that say that some of the early Jewish rulers were in the Ghana Empire around the 6th or 7th century. This doesn't mean that all the rulers of Ghana were Jewish, doesn't mean that most of them were, but at some point a few of them were. So one of the documents that we have that talks about early Jewish presence in the region is one called the Tarikh al-Fatash. This document mentions that in 1402 there was a sizable Bani Israel or Bnei Israel or Israelite community that was there in Tirdema, Mali, and that they were very rich, had wells, and that they also had a lot of plantations. The Tarikh al-Fatash goes on to state that they had 7 rulers that you see listed right now. This only shows up in manuscript C of the Tarikh al-Fatash. The other ones don't particularly mention this. So there are 3 kingdoms that existed during the time frame that we're talking about, and that's the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, and the Songhai Empire. The one that seems to be most prominent during the time that Jews were migrating was the Songhai Empire, and in many cases these 3 empires overlapped. So in order to understand why this is so important, we have to start understanding where this empire was located. Specifically, it was mostly around the Niger River, which was really big in terms of trade. The first recorded actual Jewish communities that are believed to have been in West Africa were actually started by Jews who made their way from Yemen into the region. This is around the 6th or 7th century after the war between Du Nuwas and Yemen against the Ethiopians who had invaded Yemen. So as you can see on this slide, these are kind of the short histories of these 2 migrations, which not a lot is known about this time period in terms of the Jewish communities that were in West Africa. Basically what we would have known is that they were just basically Jews from Southern Arabia, or in at some point in Central Arabia, and that for whatever reason they made their way, from East Africa into West Africa, which during that period would not have been that hard, because during that time the Sahara Desert supposedly was not as big as it is now, and there was a region called the Sahel, which would have made traveling, that area like pretty easy. So in the other video I did, I showed kind of the issues in terms of the Yehudim, Israelim marrying local women and establishing connections with local communities, as well as increasing their numbers by way of these marriages. So these slides just kind of give an idea of what could have been the situation that started it all, in terms of peoples in the region converting to Judaism, and then those people becoming part of the Jewish communities. So then the next group that we know of were, as I mentioned before, Berber Jews who either were of Jewish descent, were Berbers, or Berbers who converted to Judaism. And then the next group, of course, would have been Jews from northern Africa, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So the obvious question is, if there were all these Jews who were making their way there, and if there were all these people who converted to Judaism, what happened to them? Basically, in the late 1400s, there was a man by the name of Muhammad al-Maghli, who was from North Africa, who came to the region and didn't like the fact that there were so many Jews in the region, who he felt were flaunting the Islamic laws, the Sharia. So basically, he issued a fatwa, an Islamic law, that all the Jews in the region, the men should be killed off, the women enslaved, the children sold into slavery, the synagogues destroyed, and that anyone helping them should be murdered. So basically, this was kind of like the death knell that started, or at least started the death knell in the Jewish community. What also changed it also was the change in trade, in terms of trade routes, in terms of the ability to make trade with Mali, which Timbuktu, of course, being the main trading route or trading area that a lot of people were coming to. So at one point, we do know that a lot of this trade that took place was in different things in terms of ostrich feathers, gold, salt, that was being mined, as well as, as slaves. There were people who were enslaved who were actually, being traded, by a number of different groups of people in the region. We know that this trade, stretched all the way into North Africa, all the way into East Africa. We also know that this trade was connected to a more, I guess you could say, Asian/Middle Eastern African worldwide trade, even into Europe. And we know this partially because there were a number of different traders of a number of different religions and cultures who were part of this trade that was a worldwide connection. So the later migrations of Jews, even in this tough period, was made up of several different families that their descendants still live in Mali today. And that's, as you can see now, this is the list of those families that have descendants that are there, but now all of their descendants are Muslims because of the effects of this fatwa that was issued that I mentioned earlier. So looking at this picture here, the man that has an arrow pointing to him, his name is Ismail Haidara, and he is one of the researchers who wrote the most comprehensive history of Jews in West Africa and what happened to them. So now when we start talking about this later period where, it was a lot more dangerous for Jews to be able to travel from North Africa to West Africa, these are some of the different difficulties that took place, but there was one rabbi who was able to, overcome all of them, and his name was Rabbi Mordechai Abel. He originally was from Akka, Morocco, and was someone who was traveled across different parts of Europe, the Middle East. He became a rabbi, gained his ordination as a rabbi in Jerusalem, and came back when he was older, and basically formed a Jewish community in Timbuktu. So his travels are recorded in a number of different documents, and there's not a lot that he wrote about in terms of his actual life in Timbuktu. We know that he had a synagogue that was there, that was also their trading house, and members of his family were also part of this community, and they married into the local community. The way that we know about a lot of this information that I'm talking about now is that there are a number of documents that are preserved in one of the Jewish libraries that is in Timbuktu. There's probably around 800 or so documents that talk about the Jewish community. Some of these documents deal with, they're mainly trade documents or tax, receipts that talk about, different merchandise the Jews were involved in. And, some of these documents, of course, they all mention names, and many of these names are written on the sides of the documents with Al Yahud, which means, the people of the Jews, or Ha-Yahud, the Jew. And, some of these documents are, like I say, really interesting just in terms of mentioning names of the families that were there, because there were a number of families that, still lived there, and even their descendants now live in several villages outside of Timbuktu. These records are very important because of the fact that they show that Jewish migrations were taking place in a number of places that most people don't think, they ever would have made it to. So this is going to be the end of part one of this presentation, and it's a very brief presentation, I have to admit, in terms of what I'm presenting now, because there's more information on it. But these are some sources that you can look at if you can get your hands on them, because some of them are really tough to find, that basically talk about some of the things I'm mentioning plus more. So you can probably pause this part of the video and take a look at it.